7:51 p.m. on Saturday, June 20th, at the Marcus David Pierre Monument. There's a group of heavily armed police who are approaching the protesters.
About 10 minutes to 8, Saturday evening. Very peaceful crowd around the Lee statue. A lot of cops just showed up. Must be 50 of them. They just approached, provoking a reaction from the crowd. Not sure why they're here. There was nothing going on.
Move the cars from around the sidewalk!
Apparently they're telling people they have to move their cars from around the barriers. People have been using it for parking. That's not usually done.
As soon as y'all move the cars, they go. Y'all move the cars. Y'all want to stay here peacefully all night? I know.
This looks like a provocation to me. They could have sent just a few people.
Which is what we gonna do.
Could have sent just a few people. None of the cops have masks on, by the way.
The whole front line. Like the whole front line.
See, we can get a little closer over here. Some people are in the process of moving their cars.
Come on, let's get these cars going. First car, just lead them on. Once everybody, just lead a slow roll it out of here. Watch out, sir. Watch out. Traffic. Watch out.
So are y'all gonna start moving the cars?
Yeah, they're moving on.
The Richmond Police Department is requesting you move the cars from around the circle. Police is using a loudspeaker. The police is telling people to move their cars, and once the cars move, they will leave. Let's get a count here. Hey. People have moved their cars. This whole section here was full of parked cars. I see one left over there. The driver may not be within hearing distance.
Well, folks, this is Jackie Luqman.
And I'm Shahid Luqman.
And welcome to another episode of Live and Coffee Current Events and Politics in Luqman Nation. The most
dangerous show on social media. Anywhere. Controversial and anywhere.
Anywhere. All kinds of stuff. Welcome, Mr. Shahid Luqman, back to the co-pilot's chair. Very glad to have you back
glad to be
next
back.
to me, because it's been really lonely without my Mr. Bear. It really has been lonely and very hard to do this by myself. So, as you can see, folks, we have a very special guest this evening, and we are really, really excited about this show, because we've been working with this brother and his wife and our comrades down in Richmond for a few years, and we had been involved in some, protest actions to take down the Confederate monuments in Richmond for a while, and here we are in the midst of whatever this is, and there is going to be some action on that front finally. But as you saw with the video, not without a whole lot of resistance. So, without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, welcome our friend and comrade Phil Wilayto of the Virginia Defenders for Justice and Equality out of Richmond, Virginia. Phil, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me on. It's great to be back with y'all. I wish we could get together in person, but this will do for now.
Absolutely. Now you're gonna have to speak up a little bit so that our folks can hear you online. We've got the mics turned up as much as we can get it. But Phil, explain that video that we opened with. What was happening? Where was that? What was happening? And then we're going to get into the importance of all of these activities and what's going on in this country now from your perspective.
Well, this happened at the Lee statue, the Robert E. Lee statue, which is the most prominent of the Confederate statues in the former capital of the Confederacy. It's 60 feet tall. It weighs 12 tons. It's surrounded by a grassy circle. The land and the statue are actually owned by the state of Virginia, not by the city of Richmond. And the governor, who has vacillated on the whole questions of Confederate statues, has finally said that he wants it to come down. And there are now 3 lawsuits trying to prevent that. There's an injunction in place that's going to last for a few more weeks. Tension is building up around it, and other statues have come down during the last 3 weeks of street protests. Jefferson Davis fell over a few days ago. Christopher Columbus took a swim in the Bird Lake. General Wickham gave up the battle at Monroe Park, and there were 1 or 2 others that were connected with the Confederate cause that have taken a leave of absence from their pedestals. And of course, I had the pleasure and honor of being out the first couple of nights of the protests, and we posted pictures of the newly decorated statues of Jeb Stuart and Stonewall Jackson, Jefferson Davis, and Robert E. Lee. I feel very sorry for Admiral Matthew Murray, who was a staunch defender of the Confederacy, but his statue only got a couple of small tags. I don't think people really understand the role that he played in the Confederacy, or the fact that his solution to the problem of slavery was to sell all black people to Brazil or another slave country, because he didn't believe in slavery himself. So that was his anti-slavery position. That he deserves a lot more than he got, and I feel sorry that he's been neglected. But at any rate, things have settled around a daily pattern of protests. Sometimes things get a little frisky at night, but the grassy land circle around the Lee statue has become a kind of liberated area for protesters. They've set up tents. There's food distribution. There is intel in place. There is security, and it's become a sort of a liberated zone. So things were a little tense this past weekend because there had been several posts by right-wing organizations and individuals urging people to come to Richmond and defend these statues. One of them got quite a bit of notice, and then the author, who seemed to be an individual, said he got a number of death threats and called off his call for action and took himself down from Facebook. So that was interesting. Who's a snowflake now? So then, but it was a time when people thought that right-wingers were coming in, and I do know that there were some groups, armed right-wingers, in town that day, and a off-duty police officer with the Richmond International Airport was arrested yesterday morning when he was seen on the roof of a building armed Circle, which has now, by the way, been renamed the Marcus David Peters Circle.
Oh, wow.
In honor of Marcus David Peters, who was killed by a Richmond police officer 2 years ago while experiencing a mental breakdown. And then yesterday, the day before, Friday, we lost our chief of police here. The mayor fired him after he covered up for and lied about actions by the police department. The mayor decided to throw him under the bus and tapped the former chief of staff for the police department as the new chief, someone who who admitted to shooting a black man in the back fatally twice several years ago. There were no witnesses. He said the man pulled a gun on him. They found a gun. There were no fingerprints on the gun. The gun did not belong to the man. At least he hadn't purchased it. He's African American himself, the new chief. He's quoted as saying one of the things he liked best about the police department is being on the SWAT team. And during the time he was on the SWAT team, he was assigned to the low-income housing projects in the city. So he held a press conference the other day and said, "We're going to take our city back. I want to support my officers," and it was very belligerent and questioned by the Richmond Times Dispatch reporter about the shooting against James Gillian that he was responsible for. So Friday he issued a statement, a reminder, it was phrased, to the people to the protesters in Richmond that the police department had the right to declare gatherings illegal assemblies and issue a warning, and if the warning was not heeded, that protesters were subject to arrest and, quote, chemical agents. So this was the atmosphere when at 10 minutes to 8 yesterday, about 6 or 8 police cars started coming down Monument Avenue from the west, headed towards the Marcus David Peters Circle, in which there were about 150 people of all races, and people noticed them coming and started yelling at them. The car stopped and about 3 dozen officers got out. They weren't in full riot gear, but some of them had bulletproof vests. Several of them had large bundles of zip ties. A bunch of them had tear gas or pepper spray canisters on their chest. At least 2 of them had what looked like semi-automatic long rifles. And they just came up and stood in the street near the circle for about 5 or 6 minutes without saying anything. While the tension built and people were yelling at them and go away, there's nothing happening here, what are you doing here, F the police, so on and so forth. And then finally, the person in charge, the officer in charge, called on people to move their cars, some of which were parked next to these concrete barriers they just put up around the circle, which is not something where you usually park, and said that if you move the cars, we will leave. So some people kept yelling at the police. A group of young black activists formed a line between the police and the protesters, asked people to move the cars, which they did, and then the police gingerly started backing down the street back to their cars, drove their cars backwards down Monument Avenue and left on a side street. So I got the whole thing on video, and we wrote a piece describing it all that's posted on the Facebook page of the Virginia Defender, our newspaper, Facebook page, Virginia Defender. And my conclusion was that this was a deliberate provocation, an attempt to provoke the demonstrators into some sort of activity so the police could declare their gathering an illegal assembly and break it up and remove people from this liberated zone and quote, take back our city. It was an extremely dangerous situation. It could have easily turned into a disaster. And it was only the level-headedness of the young black activists who realized that forcing the police to leave the area would be the victory rather than some kind of physical confrontation. I think in that situation that was a correct call. it goes to show that more than 3 weeks after the beginning of the rebellion, we are in an entirely different situation in Richmond, in the country as a whole, and there's an old saying that there are decades in which nothing happens, and then there are weeks in which decades happen.
Mm-hmm.
Very astute observer of the social scene made that comment years ago, and I think that's what's happening today.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, we're gonna try to adjust your volume, Phil, because our viewers are saying that you are still really low. But I think we're gonna try to fix that on our end. You could do that, but you go ahead while I try to fix
Hey,
this
Mike,
volume.
I gotta do something about this mic. I get that a lot, on Zoom calls and so on. I'll raise my voice, but I feel like I'm shouting.
That's okay. We need you to shout.
Yeah.
Here in this frenetic activity in our home office, raising the level of voice.
Absolutely. Uh-oh.
All right, so while we're doing that, first of all, I'd like to thank our audiences for joining. Also, we'd like to thank you for joining us today with our guests. We ask that you share this video, share this stream, invite your friends, click on the notifications so that you would get notified when Luqman Nation will be streaming or broadcasting again. As we are adjusting this, because as we already say, we don't have CNN money. So, but Phil, so what we witnessed in on the video happening in Virginia, and as you had stated earlier, is happening all over the country, and it seems to be again this perfect storm pushing the United States into a certain direction. And what I'm saying is that we were talking about redefining America, redefining America's politics. And, they used to say that, that the South might have lost the physical war, but they didn't lose the ideological war. And so we see that here we are, which I would say we're still fighting the Civil War. And so my question to you is that here we are. We not only are we talking about the controversies over the Confederate statues, but now we're talking about renaming the bases that has the name of Confederate generals. There's a push in Washington, D.C. right now that's being promoted, pushed by Luqman Nation to rename the streets in Washington, D.C., those street names that have the names of former Confederate generals and all. So, Phil, we're at the precipice. And it seems to be everyone is talking about how this was centered around the lynching of George Floyd. But what is so different about this protest, in your view, as opposed to we witnessed Eric Garner, we witnessed Tamir Rice, we witnessed Sandra Bland, we witnessed Philando Castile. When it comes to unarmed black people being shot and killed, we don't have, there's no shortage of videos about that. And there has been protests, there has been some action, little to no action on the part of police reform. But what we're seeing now is the police responding, at least administratively, to a lot of demands of the protesters. What I want to ask you is, what makes this so different? What makes the George Floyd incident so different than what we've seen in the past?
Anna was just trying to help me with the sound.
Okay.
Is this any better?
Let's see. Let's take keep talking.
Well, Anna was just trying to help me with the sound, which I could use some help on. Get an external mic for this laptop.
It sounds a little better.
Okay.
Thank you, Anna. Anna is 3 feet away from me working on finishing up her thesis for a master's degree in public history, which is due later tonight. So
Wow.
It's an intense little room here.
It is. We understand what that's like. Okay, but
why has this one police murder, after so many police murders, produced such a broad, sustained reaction. I understand there have been protests now in some 2,000 cities in the United States, 5 U.S. occupied territories, and 60 countries. And some of these have been major rebellions. I mean, there has never been an urban rebellion in Richmond, Virginia, going all the way back. And we've had fires and broken windows and graffiti. And you should see the Confederate statues. They are completely
Yes.
covered with multicolored graffiti. They've become it's a new art form. I mean, there are serious academics who are arguing that they should not be cleaned off. That this is now a symbol of a new day in the country.
I mean, if I may say, it reminds me of New York during the '70s, on the, when they used to have the graffiti on the trains and all. It sort of has sort of like a time period to it. You know, like
I remember those graffiti. I lived in there in the '80s. Yeah, but this is much more joyful.
Yes.
And defiant. And plus, we don't have the hemorrhoid commercials, on the top of the train, and the sore feet and so on. You really get the impression New Yorkers have a bad way to go. Anyway, I think there were a number of things that were happening. One is, of course, the pandemic. People have been self-isolating for months. They're worried financially. They get time to think about things. They're uncertain about the future. They see how the Trump administration has completely screwed up the government's responsibility to take care of its people in a time of a national, international health crisis. So there was anxiety and fear and anger already. And then there were in quick succession, there was the police murder of Brianna Watkins in Louisville, Kentucky, sleeping in her own bed. Police break in on a no-knock warrant without identifying themselves. Her boyfriend tried to defend the two of them. She was shot to death in her own bed. Ahmaud Arbery, just outside of Brunswick, Georgia, jogging through a neighborhood that two white men considered to be their neighborhood, and confronted him and shot and killed him. The situation with Amy Cooper in New York City's Central Park, who was walking her dog without a leash in an area in which that was forbidden. It was reserved for bird watchers. She confronted a black man who was standing there watching birds. Turned out to be, not that this matters, but on the board of the Audubon Society. And when he asked her to put a leash on her dog, she said she was going to call the police and tell her a black man was threatening her. This is a woman who worked for Obama, but it personifies the Karen stereotype of a white person, a white woman pulling her race privilege to threaten a black man. These things were all on people's minds. And then, what was different, of course, about the murder of George Floyd is that you watched a video that went on for 8 minutes and 43 seconds while he begged for his life, said, "I can't breathe," called for his mother, and there's a voice, I think it's one of the police officers, but I can't see which one, who said, "Why don't you just get in the car?" Mocking him, while the officer had his knee on George Floyd's neck. And then there's no movement and no more voice from George Floyd. And for another 3 minutes,
yes,
this murderer kept his knee on the man's neck, looking at the young black woman who's videoing him with a look that clearly says, "That's right, I'm going to kill him.
right,
Not a goddamn thing you can do about it, because I'm in charge. We're in charge. You remember that. I'm going to kill him right in front of your eyes, and there's not a damn thing you can do." That, I think, was the last straw. People said, if they can do that, then there's no hope, and we're going to strike back. And it spread around the country because the same situation exists in every place where there's a black community, and even the places, Salt Lake City, where the black community is 5% of the population, the city government imposed a curfew because there were so many protests, some of them which got into property damage. first time, the majority of white people think that police brutality is a serious problem in this country. They think that black people are treated worse than white people. They think that white people are let off on things that black people would not. The consciousness has jumped. The majority of the country now recognizes, the majority of white people now recognize that racism and police brutality is a serious problem in this country. That's a sea change. And so now is the time when people can make advances. You know, we had a situation here in Virginia where our governor, Ralph Northam, a Democrat, you know, came in with all kinds of promises of doing things. He was sort of considered a moderate, which in Virginia is pretty close to being, you know, a socialist revolutionary. So he, you know, he at least wasn't terrible, you know. And then this picture emerged of him, a picture in a high school yearbook of of two young men, one dressed in blackface. Assume they were white, but one was dressed in blackface and the other in a Ku Klux Klan costume with the hood down. And he almost had resigned over that. Everyone was calling for resignation. And instead, he began to try to prove that he was really sensitive to racial oppression and started doing a number of things that people have been demanding for years. Some of them symbolic, some of them concrete. But one thing that came out of this was we realized it's not bad to have a damaged governor. We now have a mayor who is so frightened about losing the November election to a challenger, to his 3 or 4 challengers now. He just fired the police chief. The defenders had initiated a campaign to demand that the police chief resign or be fired because of all the things that he's done to cover up for corrupt police, brutal police in this period. We were set to go with the press release at 5 o'clock, and at 2 o'clock, the mayor called a press conference and asked for the resignation of the police chief.
Wow.
And we're going, well, shoot, now we're going to come up with another demand. The family of Marcus David Peters has issued a 7-point list of demands, and one of them was for the Marcus Alert, which is for a program for people for the first responders in the case of someone who is experiencing a mental crisis, that the first responders be mental health professionals and not police officers. The mayor has agreed to that. The city council has agreed to that. And it's now being discussed on the legislative level as a statewide initiative.
Wow.
The family demanded a civilian review board with subpoena power. The mayor has agreed to that. The city council has agreed to that. The family demanded taking down all the Confederate statues on Monument Avenue. The mayor has agreed to that. The city council has agreed to that. The governor has agreed to that. It's since expanded the demand to all the Confederate symbols in the city. And the other demands are to reopen the case of Marcus David Peters, to defund the police department, which means transferring a good chunk of their funding into social services, education, job training, jobs, and so on, to solve the social problems that give rise to crime in the first place, and complete amnesty for all arrested protesters. Drop all charges against all protesters without exception.
Now, Phil, if I may say, now we still see that the person in the White House. Now you and I and Jackie, we were on the front lines down. Well, you guys, the Virginia Defenders was down in the front lines during the Charlottesville incident. We joined you guys, and we were in the trenches, and we fought alongside you guys right after that. But here you have this guy in the White House who was basically encouraging the white supremacists, as you know, saying that they were good people on both sides. And here it is, a couple of years later, and we're having this thing. And again, you still have this guy who believes, you're talking about the mayor of Richmond, worried about whether he's going to win re-election. But the mayor of Richmond is trying to do what the people are asking. But you got this guy in the White House who seems to feel that it's still within his advantage to stoke these cultural wars. And so why is that?
Well, you know, when I look at national politics, I always start from the premise that the 1% of the population that is most wealthy calls the shots politically. And, you know, that used to be considered sort of a left-wing view. I think the Occupy movement a few years ago helped to popularize the idea that there really is a 1%. Here in Virginia, we're always told that the state legislature is the oldest continuing legislative body in the Western Hemisphere. It's total BS because it wipes out thousands of years of self-rule by indigenous people. But in terms of the European colonialists, the legislature traces its roots to the House of Burgess, established in 1619, which was the wealthiest colonialists forming a ruling body to control the rest of the colonialists who were rebelling because they didn't want to go out and work in the tobacco fields. And that didn't get resolved until later in the year when the first Africans were brought to Jamestown and purchased by the governor and other plantation owners who put to work growing tobacco, which is what made Virginia a cash crop colony and set the stage for the development of the United States. I think I went off on a rabbit hole there. But we're, and I don't want to pretend that I'm going to come back. Finish the question.
Well, I mean, here it is that we have a pandemic, and we have this this cultural war, which we all agree, which is unprecedented in this nation's history, at least in this modern history. And yet, there's no leadership in the White House. There has been no leadership, right, with COVID, no leadership with this, and yet here it is. You have this president who went down to Tulsa, and again, referring to Chinese, referring to diseases as with the racist nicknames of Kung Flu, and all. You know, it's still this same old racist baiting that this guy does for some reason that he feels that this is in his advantage. So I mean, how is this that we're on the precipice here of America being redefining America, which is the theme of the show tonight?
Yeah, we're both on,
right.
We're both on the edge of the country redefining itself, and the divisions between the progressive people and the reactionary people is increasing to the point where some on both the left and the right are talking about a new civil war.
Yes.
I think it's a little premature for this, but where I was going before was that I think this country is run by that 1%. And you look at Trump and you say, well,
Uh-oh. Looks like Phil looks like he froze. Uh-oh, we're going to see if we can get Phil back.
All right, well, let's take a break.
Oh, there he is.
Okay, all right, there it is.
Your internet connection is unstable.
Right. Well, this is what the limitations of technology.
This is what happens when you don't have that CNN money.
Yeah. Your audio is fading on me.
Uh-oh, okay.
Fortunately. So I don't want to interrupt you. Go ahead.
Well, no, well, what we're going to do is we're going to take a break. And when we come back, we're going to try to get some of these glitches out. Be just a couple of minutes, folks. Please remain with us as we try to deal with a little bit of these glitches. We'll be right back.
We'll be right back.
Could I just make one final comment before we go?
Yes.
Okay. So, I think the reason why Trump is president is because what he has done for that 1% is almost unprecedented. Even with the pandemic, their wealth is increasing exponentially.
Yes.
He has removed regulations that limited their profit making. He has done these incredible tax breaks that have greatly increased the national debt, but has put money into the wealthiest people's pockets. He has rolled back social legislation. They have never done so well as they're doing under President Trump. So the fact that he's a complete idiot and is creating all these divisions in the country, which may or may not be to their benefit, they have been okay with that, so long as in the short term they're going to make all these tremendous increases in profit. which we have not had in this country. Even in the 20s, when the Ku Klux Klan could pull out 20, 30,000 people on a march, we have not gotten to the point where Germany went in the 30s, when the industrial class was worried about a left-wing revolution,
Yes.
where Germany had the largest communist party outside of the Soviet Union, and they decided to encourage the influence of Adolf Hitler and his Nazi parties as a wedge against the left, because they didn't want to suppress it with the regular police forces in extra-legal ways. Here in the United States, the ruling class has not decided that it needs a fascist movement to control the working class, which has been relatively quiet for decades, where the percentage of the private sector workers who are unionized is about 6%, and maybe 16 in the public sector. They haven't needed a true fascist movement. But Trump, who is a somewhat independent figure in terms of his position in the ruling class, has toyed with the development of an actual fascist movement. And there are, I read, I think it was in the New York Times, that only 3% of the population agrees with the white supremacist ideology of the Nazis and fascists that showed up in Charlottesville. You know what 3% of 325 million people are?
What is it?
A lot of people.
That's a lot of people.
And if only 10% of those were willing to come out on the streets, we're still talking about a few million people who play at being soldiers and fantasize about a war with the left or with the government. It's a serious situation.
Yes.
So while our side is in the majority numerically, the other side is potentially more violently dangerous. I think Trump has egged us on. I don't know if he's prepared to take on the role of an actual Führer, but he has encouraged this development of an armed, violent, racist, anti-government movement that he may not be able or willing to control. And we're seeing that on a small scale show up here in Richmond. And that's why we're also seeing a section of the demonstrators arming themselves. It's an interesting period, and the ruling class is confused about how to deal with it. At the very least, we need to keep getting more and more people out on the streets and making our demands and forcing concessions from the ruling class, so that the fundamental political balance of power changes. And it's going to be different in different cities. It's going to be different locally than it is nationally. Our great failing at this period is the weakness of the left. If you can even say that we have an organized left, there is no unifying force in the rebellion, but it is what it is, and those of us who are consciously political need to be in the streets, shoulder to shoulder with the youth, as well as defending them in every possible way, and, when appropriate, helping them to develop the kinds of demands that can give some shape and form to this rebellion.
Now let's talk about since we're getting close to that time. Let's talk about the international scene, Jackie.
Yeah.
Because this is playing out pretty big around the world. As you just mentioned earlier, Phil, there's 60 protests going on outside of the United States in 60 different countries. The United States, you know, there was a story that was on CNN last week, where Mike Pompeo chastised the Chinese government about its handling of protesters in Hong Kong, and the Chinese foreign minister kind of like clapped back and said that, well, I can't breathe.
He didn't kind of clap back.
He
that
clapped
was
back.
Like, look.
Right, I can't breathe. So, you know, the United States is it's bad enough that the United States, and this is even before Trump, that the United States has been losing the moral high ground, or its moral leadership in the world, and it seemed to have just basically just like turned to dust under the Trump administration. But where does this lead, Phil? Where does this lead the United States, or put the United States as far as being a global economic leader?
Well, it's a global military leader. It has the largest military in human history. Spends more money
seems
looks
like
like
we're
we're-
frozen again.
Yep, looks like Phil is frozen again. We're hoping that he's able to catch up, and we're hoping he can hear. Oh, we go.
Okay, here we go.
That continues to pursue the neo-colonialist policy of extraction of natural resources, exploitation of cheap labor, and reselling back manufactured goods, while the Chinese have helped to develop an infrastructure that is primarily geared towards promoting Chinese trade with African countries, but there are benefits. It's not a pure motive on their part, but it's more beneficial. And countries are seeing that there may be an opportunity for them to do better with dealing with the Chinese economically than with the United States. In terms of moral leadership, the U.S. has a system of bourgeois democracy that is superior than many right-wing dictatorships in the world, but it's still the rule of that 1%.
Right.
In terms of but absolute moral authority, a country that was founded on slavery and perpetuated Jim Crow apartheid for 90 years until the 60s, and has still had this epidemic of police shootings and racial and gender inequality, should not claim to be the moral leader of anything. But I think it's because they have been willing to provide some financial aid to some countries under certain conditions, and they've been allowed to get away with the charade. But what we're seeing, is more the development of a multipolar world in which the United States only maintains its leading position because of its dominant military position, its military power, and is willing to impose its will unilaterally on Asia, Africa, and Latin America based on its military might. I think those days are numbered, and that the U.S. Ideally would settle into a position where they would be willing to say, we are one country among more than 200, and we are willing to get along with the rest of the world on a basis of peace and justice and equality, but don't hold your breath for that. The capitalist system is geared to freedom, justice, and equality. It's geared to profit making any way that it needs to do, by any means necessary. So we're in a changing world, in a changing country, and it's no time for us to take a break or just sit back and look to see how things go. We have to be actively involved and do our best to try to see that things can move in a positive, forward direction.
I mean, I'm glad you ended by saying that we're in a changing world, and the country is changing. Now, Phil, I've always felt like even though the South technically lost the Civil War, I've always felt like ideologically they really won. And we've been living in this country under a white supremacist civil war, well, not civil war, but Southern strategy led ideology. This is not to say that white supremacy is limited to the South, but in terms of the ideology of this country, I really kind of feel like the ideology that fueled the slave-holding states of the South to secede in order to fight a war to defend slavery, I feel like that ideology they basically were able to take that L on the military battlefield and translate it into political wins. They scuttled Reconstruction. They shaped the Congress by filling it with a bunch of Southern sympathizing, former slave state holding, sympathizing white supremacists. And it doesn't matter which political party they belong to. It's the ideology we're talking about. The Daughters of the Confederacy rewrote the entire curriculum around slavery so that slavery wasn't taught as this horrendous crime against humanity that it was, but it was just this kind of genteel thing that the Southerners did, that was just kind of a part of their, a part of their culture and heritage. So, I mean, do you feel like we are finally ending the ideological civil war that has probably been waging since
Since
1865.
Yeah, since 1865. Yeah.
Yeah. Right after the Civil War, there was an organization called the Southern Historical Society. Was it the name of that? It was founded in New Orleans, and it was to preserve the Confederacy's view of the Confederacy in the Civil War and the pre-Civil War period. And it was moved to Richmond after just a few years, and Richmond became the center for the promotion of what has come to be known as the Lost Cause mythology. The United Daughters of the Head of the Confederacy are headquartered here in Richmond. That's the organization that was responsible for erecting many of these Confederate statues, not only in the South, but they're in 36 states, the North,
Wow.
the West, the Northwest, and they're still going up today. They were the ones who initiated a project to censor textbooks, which at that time, whenever we're involved in a struggle, I always try to also read a book about the history of the issue that we're dealing with.
Right.
So I've been reading about the development of the Lost Cause, and history books were only being written for the first time around the 1890s. This was a new science, and the books were written in the North, and they often had a somewhat northern bias in the history, including the objective description of the war, of the Civil War, as a fight ultimately over slavery. So they set up committees across the South to censor these books. And then since the South was such a large market for textbooks, not the biggest, but a big percentage of the market, the national publishers began to adjust the narrative on the war. So they were winning on the question of monuments. They were winning on the questions of how the war was being presented. He began the Children of the Confederacy organization with pageants and ceremonies and games, all designed to indoctrinate children into the basic tenets of the Lost Cause mythology, which was that the United States was not a republic that could not be divided, that individual states had the right to separate and secede, that the war was basically over states' rights, that slavery was not a central issue of the war, and that it was largely a benign institution, that the South only lost because of the North's advantages in numbers and resources, that the South had the best generals, the South had the bravest soldiers, that it was a noble lost cause that should be celebrated. And after the compromise of 1877, when the Northern troops were pulled out of the South and ended Reconstruction, there was an attempt at at reconciliation between the North and the South that was basically an agreement that white men should view each other as brothers and forget about the whole issue of black emancipation, black slavery, black struggle, black participation in the Union Army, the 200,000 black people who fought in the Union Army and Navy. It was a reconciliation that promoted the view that the war was an unfortunate war between brothers, and that we needed to get over that and embrace each other. And that is why the U.S. Army named 11 of its Army bases after Confederate generals who had taken up arms against the United States government in defense of slavery. That is why my father did his basic training at Fort Lee here in Virginia. That is why the largest statue to anyone in the capital city of Richmond, Virginia, is to Robert E. Lee, who commanded the Northern Army of Virginia and owned 78 human beings as slaves. They won the ideological war, and this tremendous grassroots, broad and deep uprising against racism has also settled on these symbols of white supremacy and begun to explode the mythology that was built up over so many decades. And that's why on the struggle that began in defense of the right of George Floyd to simply live has also developed this whole anti-Confederate offensive, because it's basically a struggle against racism and white supremacy. that can uproot the foundations, the social foundations of this country and the ideology of white supremacy if it continues to develop in the way it's going.
Well, I mean, we're coming to the close of our show, but before we end, Phil, give us all your information, man. I mean, we're comrades in the struggle with you. Give us more about the Virginia Defenders and where you can be contacted and what's going on.
You can look up our Facebook page, the Virginia Defenders for Freedom, Justice, and Equality. You can Google us. We have a website. We are a small organization. We have 15 members across the state of Virginia and Washington, D.C. Currently 12 of our members are African American, one is Japanese American, and 2 are white. We're all volunteer. We were founded in 2002. We have a quarterly newspaper called the Virginia Defender that we publish 4 times a year. We are always looking for new members. We are founded on the principle of the respect for the right of self-determination for oppressed peoples. We've always been majority women. We helped found the Virginia Prison Justice Network, which is now the largest and most influential coalition of prisoner support organizations in Virginia, and distinguishes itself by 2 of its steering committee members being longtime incarcerated activists. And you can look up Virginia Prison Justice Network also on Facebook or its website. We've been involved in struggles to take down the Confederate statues since 2007. We're probably best known for the 18-year struggle to reclaim and properly memorialize the Shockoe Bottom area of Richmond that at one time was the epicenter of the U.S. domestic slave trade. And Anna Edwards, my wife, life partner, and comrade, who is descended from people sold from Virginia in the 1840s, sold from Richmond, heads up our Sacred Ground Historical Reclamation Project, which has finally wrung a concession from the mayor to endorse the community proposal for a 9-acre Shockoe Bottom Memorial Park.
All right, all right.
That took that particular section of the struggle has gone on for 5 years now, but we got all his mayoral opponents, challengers, to endorse, and so he finally endorsed as well. So we're hoping that's going to go forward. We're an activist organization. We've been on the streets literally every day and night in this so far 3-week rebellion. We've done jail support work. We've been arrested. We've been tear gassed. We formed a defense effort for a young black woman who was arrested in the protests, one of the protests outside the police department. We defend everyone who participates in the rebellion. We have our own view on the best tactics and strategies, but we leave no warrior behind.
I can say that.
So what we follow throughout our history, and that's why we have good relationships with people from different communities and different political tendencies. We believe in the united movement, and we believe we should move together towards a more just, equitable, and non-capitalist society, and that's about as far as our principles of unity allow me to express it.
Well, I'll tell you this, Phil, and I say this with all affection and sincerity. When when Jackie and I joined, and at the height of what was going on in Charlottesville, and when there was very serious confrontations with white supremacists, and I tell you, I mean, things gotten ugly. Things could have got uglier. And I tell you, Phil, when those white supremacists during that time, were talking about storming where the Statue of Lee was, and we were there. And I just got to say, brother, I mean, the way that you organized us, and I was on the security detail with you, and you and I and the other guys that was in that security detail and the girl, we were ready to do whatever we needed to do to protect our people. And I tell you, man, your leadership, man, was just superb in that, man, because I was willing to follow you through the gates of hell, man. when we were doing that kind of stuff. So, I mean, this, Jackie and I say all the time that this isn't this isn't for punks, man. This kind of work is not for punks, man. I mean, we said that that white supremacy is not going to give its power up without a fight. So there's going to be some of us, man. We already got those of us who have lost their lives, but there's going to be a lot of us, man, that's going to get hurt in this, and so this is just a reality. Malcolm said there is no such thing as a bloodless revolution, none at all. And Phil, I just wanted to say now, we tell our audience all the time, Jackie, that the revolution has to be funded. I mean, it's all well and good to support, but the revolution has to be funded. Phil, how can people who want to fund the Virginia Defenders do that?
Well, we've been very cautious in this period about asking for funds.
Okay.
People donating to community bail funds, organizations that are feeding the homeless in the midst of the pandemic and these protests, and so on. And as an all-volunteer organization, our financial needs are modest. But people have been sending us donations, which is great. And we do publish the newspaper, which costs about $1,100 an issue. We have a modest office that the rent is only $250 with utilities, but it's still something. All of our members pay a monthly pledge. But if we had more money, we could do more things.
Yes, that's right.
Go on the website of the Virginia Defenders for Freedom, Justice, and Equality. Just Google it; it'll come up. It's a blog spot. On the right-hand side, there's a donate button, and you can make a donation through PayPal or directly with a debit card or credit card. If you want to send us a donation of $25 or more, it's tax deductible. If you write a check made out to UPAL, UPAL, that's United Parents Against Lead, which is our fiscal sponsor. It's headed up by a former defender. It's a nonprofit. A check made out to UPAL and sent to our post office box, which is listed on the Facebook pages and the websites. Much more than money, we need participation.
Yes.
We would love to expand the newspaper distribution, so we need folks to help with that. There are many projects we'd like to initiate. We have committees that work on the prison issues, the Confederate statute issues, Shackle Bottom, and always anti-war, which is a greatly neglected area of work in this country today. So people can help if they live in the Richmond area, certainly, but throughout the state of Virginia and outside as supporters. So just contact us. I do want to emphasize one thing. I'm the only old white guy in the organization. And I'm sorry, but I've been doing this for more than 50 years,
Yeah.
so I have some skills. So what we're trying to do is pass the baton. This is a relay race, and fortunately we have wonderful young activists coming up who are playing leadership roles in the street struggles and in the ongoing projects that we have. So you'll be turned off by that if you're thinking that this is one of those organizations that's a bunch of old white folks. We welcome old white folks, but we are pleased that young black activists and white activists, fresh from the streets, are approaching the defenders saying they like what we're doing and they would like to be part of the organization.
Yes.
So defendersfje@hotmail.com. That's the email address. Defendersfje for Freedom, Justice, Equality @hotmail.com. Message us from our Facebook page. We're also on Twitter and Instagram, or I am at least. We're about to set up accounts for the newspaper. Come and help us. But if you don't want to join us, do something.
Yeah, exactly.
No one can afford to sit on the sidelines. Silence is complicity. Silence is death. And I know that most people who listen to your program are already involved in the struggle. So hats off to them. And thank you, new generation that has finally come forward and has forced these changes that some of us have been working on for so long.
Well, Well, we thank you, Phil, for joining us. And again, Jackie and I will be talking to you a little later on because we have work to do with the Virginia Defenders.
Yep.
And so we thank you, Phil. We thank you, Anna, who's in the background, because he has a secret weapon like I have a secret weapon. And so, Phil, we're going to be talking to you. Thank you for sharing your time with us. Folks, Jackie, you have the final word?
Yeah, this is the work. This is the work, and please check out our friends and comrades at the Virginia Defenders. You know, the Luqmans, we don't mess around with people who are not serious about this work. And if people thought that this was a game and this is just something that you could do on the weekends every once in a while, maybe it was that a while ago. But now, we really are having to fight for what we want this country to be. So, thank you all very much for joining us. Share this video if you're on YouTube. Subscribe to us on YouTube. If you're on Facebook, like us on Facebook. We are on Twitter. Consider becoming a patron. If you like what you see and hear out of Luqman Nation, you can find us on Patreon at patreon.com/Luqman Nation. LUQMANNATION. We're getting out of here. Thank you so much, Phil and Anna. As always, y'all, be good to each other. Be really good to each other. And peace if you are willing to fight for it, because guess what? We are now. Good night.
Good night.
Thanks so much. It's really been wonderful seeing you again, talking with you again. Thank you.
We love you, Phil.